So this is David Ross, and welcome once again to the Lions Roar podcast. I don't think anybody is going to be surprised about what I'm going to talk about today, if you've been on Facebook in the last day and a half. But I'm going to maybe do it in a way that you're not expecting. I'm going to go piece by piece, and as usual, when I think I'm going to do something long, I'm going to go by some notes to make sure I don't lose track of some of my thoughts. So, I'm dedicated, as everyone that follows me knows, to the idea of truth, and that means, the necessary corollary to that is you have to call out misinformation when it's being spread. I believe that one of the biggest problems for Chinese martial arts is the spreading of misinformation. So, let's ask, why do people spread misinformation? Well, one reason is just simply ignorance. Probably the most common example was their teacher told them something, they took it to be fact, and they just, said it again. They just passed it along. This is very common, but that sort of falls into that first category, which is sort of ignorance, meaning you're not aware of what the facts are. You're not aware of the history of China or Chinese martial arts. You haven't read all the research. Remember that for 50 years at least, there has been intensive research in China. And, maybe you don't have access to it because you don't read Chinese. Only recently has it been started to be available in English. But there's research being done in China and in Taiwan. Very good, historically, academically rigorous history being done for about 50 years. There is all kinds of information out there, but you're not aware of it. You don't have the skills to get through it. Whatever reason, but then you're ignorant. So then my next obvious question is, if you're ignorant, why are you spreading information? If you don't know any better, just don't do it. The argument came up recently, for example, somebody that has a YouTube channel and is located in China and has some stuff, and people say it's very questionable, and somebody said, well, maybe he feels like, the Chinese government is looking over his shoulder and he doesn't want to, get into trouble. And I just said, well, then just don't spread propaganda. Don't do the government's job. If you don't know, don't do it. So then the next corollary to that, obviously, is you have an agenda. You're spreading misinformation to advance your personal agenda. And that's the most harmful because you're misleading people. And, why are you misleading people? There are a variety of reasons, obviously. You're running a school and you're trying to make more money. You're trying to cover up your own inadequacies. There's a lot of reasons. So let's talk about when we talk about Chinese martial arts. First of all, as I discuss in my book, we are limited by the resources that we have. And in a lot of cases, people that were doing martial arts were illiterate or semi-illiterate, semi-literate or illiterate. They show up in government records only when they were doing things that would have brought them to the attention of government officials. And then later on, you had people that were kind of like the new age people, like they were educated, but they were kind of like saw martial arts as an interesting hobby or a sideline, where they were quote unquote slumming and they were hanging out with these kung fu guys and they were writing stuff and it wasn't necessarily that accurate. We have a couple of good documents. General Qi's document from the, early mid Ming Dynasty is an excellent source, but it's not necessarily the most complete. We have a couple other things. And then, of course, there's all this talk about manuscripts. And I'm extremely skeptical about manuscripts, especially when they say that they're really ancient. The most famous one being the Tai Chi one that was quote unquote discovered, under a pile of bags of salt. It just happened to be near the teacher and just happened to, advance that teacher's, idea. And it was written in a style that probably, like I said, was too educated for the typical person that was doing martial arts. So we don't have a lot of sources. So if we talk about anything pre-Qing, we're at best speculating. And we can get like a couple of, maybe sources. The corollary to this also is that if you say go to Beijing right now and see what they're doing, well, we got problems with that. You got problems with basically almost anything that was stuck in the mainland 49 on. And especially because, I think in the initial period, I would say 54 is about the most important period because that's when they, had the official government body that took over the practice of martial arts for civilians. Now, again, we've always talked about this. Martial arts for police and military was a different story. But what we sort of think of as contemporary wushu in 54, it's a good year because, for example, Chade-san, pointed out that there were provincial civilian, open to civilian sparring championships still in 54. So, as they created that thing and as they started implementing what we now think of as the modern wushu program, probably didn't start, taking root until, 55, maybe 56 even. But after that, and we have this problem too, which is that it's very simple, very straightforward. If just one generation didn't make a really concentrated effort to make sure that all the material was passed on correctly, then the next generation doesn't know it exists. And then the third generation just thinks that's the way it's always been. And so saying go to Beijing right now and go into a park, or go see a style as it is now, doesn't tell you a lot. Sometimes also you just got to look, and I'm going to get more into this as I move on. But, sometimes we invoke the duck rule, which is if it looks like a duck, it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck. It's a duck. If they talk about striking, but they're talking about constantly turning, like I hit you here and I turn, I hit you there. If you really study Chinese martial arts, that's not hitting. That's the turning, the rotating of the body, the junsan, in Cantonese, zhuanxian in Mandarin, I always default to Cantonese. That turning, it's usually a key that these movements are either what we would think of as na or shui, locking or throwing. If you look at a movement, for example, with stances and arms extended, where, you could see, and again, if you've been training correctly, you'll see what you're doing is you're scissoring someone's body between your leg and your arm. This is zhuang. Those throws. But look at things that are so simple. There's a couple of terms, and I'm going to go into this later, that are so universal in Chinese martial arts that you just know that they're telling you something. Pi, chopping, for example. Another one, kao, leaning, which we think of as shouldering. Well, what do you think shouldering is? I'm striking you, then I'm getting in, and then I'm leaning on you to throw you. So you don't need to tell me, oh, there's a manuscript and it tells me this move is a throw. I don't need that. I really don't. I can look at the movement. I can look at the movement in context of other movements, and I can decide it's a throw or it's a joint lock. And also, if you've been doing this long time, and I've been mucking around in Chinese martial arts, different traditions for 40 plus years now, and you learn, body method, and you learn how things move, you look at the movement and say, that can be this, that, and the other thing. And you also start to learn that most moves can be striking, locking, throwing, the famous thing in my school, which is this, that, or this? Is it this, or is it this? And the answer is yes. So, like you're speculative anything about preaching, you're questionable anything since 49, especially 56 and on. But let's look at what sources we do have. And again, the initial argument here was, is Chinese martial arts grappling or striking based? And I would say the initial question itself is absurd. Is it striking or is it grappling based? The answer is yes. It's both. It has to be both. But let's go back. The earliest records we have of anything that resembles martial arts in China would be what they call Jiaoli, which goes to the Book of Rites, which is the Zhou dynasty. So, Jiaoli, which, the first character Jiao I'm going to go into in a little bit. This is the term for wrestling. It remained a popular term. Later on, Shui Jiao really doesn't sort of emerge into a term until the 20th century. Ma Liang is probably the originator of this term. And what's interesting is that because it was a new term, one of the people that wrote his foreword didn't use that term, used Jiao Li, because that was the more standard term for wrestling. In the realm of what we would call legend, there's Jiao Di, not Jiao Li, Jiao Di. And we're told that Jiao Di was wrestling with horned helmets to which, once you gain control with the wrestling, you then gorge your opponent. This is in the realm of legend. Whether this actually happened or not is speculative at best. I have said, though, that the idea that two horned animals locking their horns is a good metaphor for wrestling in general. But going back to the Zhou Dynasty, we have something that looks like wrestling. Now, Sun Tzu wrote in around 300 BC, Jiji, which is a first record we have of striking. So we have wrestling, and then we have some striking coming along. About 313, 328 is when he was active, talking about Jiji. And then in the Han Dynasty historical bibliographies, which tell us about the Han period, which is 206, BCE, which is before Common Era, to 8 CE, which is Common Era, we have Shobo. Shobo, is described specifically because remember that wrestling, whatever like Jiao obviously, when we're talking about, using horned helmets to gore people with the horns, we're talking about combat. But Jiao Li also, like when we talk about Shui Jiao in general, we talk about wrestling in general, it has ritual, it has recreation, and it has combat. And I'll get back to that again also in this discussion. But Shobo is specifically described as combat. It has striking, also has grappling, but it is not intended for any kind of ritual or recreational use. It's designed for combat. Now, if you look at General Qi's book, you see that he says, empty-hand fighting, is not really good for combat. We'll get back to this in a little bit. It's good for preparation. But we know that Shobu was considered combat. And again, what kind of combat are we talking? We're talking about combat with large armies, and chariots on the battlefield. Or are we talking about combat between, like a village and another village? Or are we talking about combat between you and me? But going back to, 8 Common Era, we have Shobu, which is a Chinese martial art, as we understand it, having both striking and grappling. And, the Shobu that was recreated in the modern era, is heavily Shui Jiao influenced. We don't know if, again, it's a recreation, so we don't know how much the balance is, but we know there was both. So this, much ado about nothing, trying to argue that it's not grappling based, or that there's systems that have all of striking but no Qina and no Shui Fa, no throwing techniques. And the Chun, Chun Chu, Chun Fa, these terms for fist fighting. I kind of try to avoid the term boxing in my book because, that's associated with the boxers. And in my book, I talk about how the boxers were not really, what we would consider mainstream legitimate martial arts people. They were people that believed they were possessed by spirits. The mainstream martial arts community, meaning martial skills that were originally used for combat, filtered down to the common people, on the village level, and were used as methods of, self-protection and personal defense. So, in that sense, that's what the Chuan means. It doesn't mean that they're only hitting with closed fists. How literal do you have to be? It's Monday, so it's the moon day. No, don't be that literal. It is fist methods as opposed to riding your chariot with your spear and your archers backing you up. It is methods that are being personally used and probably derives even to the point where it's lower than the village militia level. The village militia level where they're still doing group formations with spears because they're still thinking about a group fighting another group. When we're talking about somebody learning a personal martial art for their personal use, whether that's self-defense or it's, just advancing your own personal interests, that's what, Chun Fa, Chun Shu is. It does not mean they're only using fists. Just like Bagua Zhang, Bagua palm, isn't all palms. piqua, I mean, again, we also see that if we go back in the literature and you look at my book, more things were called chuan that then later they added palm to, when they were trying to differentiate. And again, some of this is the marketplace, make myself different. But going back to this idea that, well, what was it? Twin fa, twin shu. Well, it filtered down, like I said, from the combat. Now, you can look at Chinese combat. You can look at Western combat, let's say with swords. Right, on the battlefield with a sword. Well, you have a sword and I have a sword. And I've talked about this before because I was talking about the history of Savat. It's the same story, right? I go to hit you with the sword, you go to hit me with the sword, and we end up clinched up, and you're holding my arm that has the sword with your free hand, and I'm holding your arm that holds your sword with my hand. So we're going to kick each other, knee each other in the groin when we can, sweep each other. Maybe I'm going to kind of twist your arm, twist your wrist with that hand that's holding your arm to try to disarm you. If not disarm you, just sort of, move the sword out of the way. So that's china. Or I'm going to try to throw you. Throwing, particularly of armored people. And again, it's astounding that people don't realize this. All this stuff came from battlefield combat. If you're wearing armor, I may not punch you, right? There's a big argument that, methods of striking with your hands came later because it became when it filtered down into the general population. But there's no question that as far as a combat skill, throwing somebody, make them fall down to the ground, especially if they're in armor. Because then they're rolling around like a turtle trying to get back up, and it's easy to stab them, step on them, run them over with your chariot. I've talked about this before. This is why there's not a lot of ground fighting in Chinese martial arts, because it kept this conception that it was, derived from combat, a battlefield combat. And the general presumption was that if you fell down on a battlefield, you were probably going to die. And in the larger, engaging group aesthetic, some people are going to fall down and die. Only later, and this happened with jiu-jitsu in Japan, again, as a combat art, it didn't have, as a samurai, my group against your group thing, it didn't have the ground fighting. The ground fighting came later when it filtered down among the people, and it became a personal method where if I fall down, I'm not going to write myself off as a inevitable casualty. I'm going to do everything possible to try to survive myself. And so then we had ground techniques. All right, so people say, ti da shui na, that that formula that's so popular, it's relatively recent. It is. Okay? But that doesn't mean that the concept isn't very old. And again, we're going back to, Han Dynasty Shobu to talk about this, and the fact that there was wrestling before, and what I said about also invoke the duck rule, look at it if it's logical. I don't care about some secret manuscript that was found under a bag of rocks. I really don't. And again, well, let's look at General Chi's book, 32 positions, right? Everybody goes, well, they're striking. Yeah, well, if you've done Chinese martial arts, they can be striking. Like I said, they can be china, they can be throwing. Just because somebody doesn't go, here, let me hold you by the hand. And the Chinese martial arts are the most notorious for this. So why pretend that you don't know this? Chinese martial arts are the most notorious for, here, you figure it out. I argue that's why they're still kind of retarded. I mean retarded in the sense that they have not developed, they have not grown, they have not, become modern, they have not become, they seem still anachronistic. Because, that was the way they did things. So don't tell me the book has, the secret manuscript of Master X had to tell you that this move is a throw. Especially when it's zhuang and it's, clearly you're scissoring the guy, or it's guan, or it's cow, or it's something like that. Some movements just scream at you, and you cannot possibly be, you cannot possibly be that dumb. So, you look at the movement. Like I said, you look at cow, you look at zhuang, you look at guan, you look at ko. You look at all these movements. You go back and you think about the logic of if you're really fighting, right? And remember, Chuan, Chuan Shu, Twin Fa, whatever you want to call it, generally was described as, these teachers that went around, these Tuan Shi, these Wu Shi that went around, were described as teaching striking, wrestling, staff, spear, and sword. Sometimes two kinds of sword, the straight sword and the broadsword. Weapons were still very much part of the program curriculum arsenal of civilian martial artists. So, trying to argue that, that there wasn't grappling before, that somehow it just, found its way in the last 50 years is ludicrous. Not only that, you have to go back to that kind of thing, like I said, which is that, if you were a soldier and you were on the battlefield and your weapon ran out of bullets and the enemy's weapon, was from, someone that had been killed in the process of the battle, was there, would you not pick it up and fire it? So tell me, who would create a combat system where would you go, I only want to have one kick, no chin-na, no throwing whatsoever. Or I'm only going to do stuff with my palm, never with my fist. Or I'm only going to do things with my fist and never my palm. Does that make sense to you? Is that logical? I don't care who tells you that. That's the other thing we're going to get to in a second, right? Don't just buy it because somebody tells you that's what it is. Don't. It's the wrong thing to do. Think with your brain. Apply Occam's razor. Would anybody really do that? No. They wouldn't. So, why do we have these agendas? Well, like I said, since 55, 56, in some places, again, in mainland China, we can say it was a definite purpose. I remember in the 80s when the Wushu teams came over from China, and people would ask them about sparring, and they said the official position of the government is that comrades do not fight comrades, therefore they do not spar, and they do not work on applications. This was different, right? These were the Wushu people. These are the people that were the goodwill, the soft power, the diplomatic, people there. They were not the police and the military. We know from Chandai-san, we know from numerous other accounts, the police and the military were beating the living crap out of each other and were encouraged to do so. And that's teachers like Chandai-san were plucked out of the general population because they still knew how to use these methods to fight. And they were purposely sent to teach the military and the police how to fight while the civilians were controlled. We also know, though, if you look at the 54, going back to 54, that magic year, Wu Gongyi versus Chan Hak-fu, that in Hong Kong, not everybody was doing everything right, and Taiwan, Taiwan was a little more of a free-for-all, and I've suggested that's because the military was in charge of the government, and the military was pro-martial arts. But we have examples. Martial arts have deteriorated. Don't tell me, just because there's a Chinese master in Beijing, and he must be right because he's Chinese. No. I refuse to accept that position. So, why do people want you to believe that there is not Qin-Na in every system, or there's not Shui-Fa in every, system, or that some systems are only strikes? Well, if you're running a school and you don't have these things to show people, it's easier to say my system doesn't have them than to say I never learned them and you're getting you ordered the hero sandwich, you're only getting half of it, and you're only getting, the bottom half of the half. And people then, also want you just to believe them, and here I'm getting to it, drum roll please, because they're Chinese. Now, obviously, they're Chinese martial arts. Obviously, I believe that you have to have, you can't, again, I'm going to quote somebody, I'm not going to drag them into this, but they said, you can live in China physically without living in China in the culture. So there are people in China that have nothing to do with the culture, and there are people that are in China that get it totally into the culture. And there are people like me who have not spent an inordinate amount of time in China, a very limited amount of time in China compared to my training. But I spent the time definitely in the culture. I mean, Chan Dai-san did not speak English. I learned how to speak Cantonese. I got a master's degree in Chinese history. I studied not just Chinese, but classical Chinese. I've been doing, living among it. My first wife was from Shanghai. I used to speak Mandarin with my in-laws, Cantonese with her, and I would go home sometimes and forget how to speak English. And again, this is not, I'm just saying that it is helpful to be in the culture. It is helpful to speak the language. But that doesn't mean that every Chinese person is the be-all and the end-all. And let's remember also that, they're Chinese people that don't know the culture, don't know the language. Chinese doesn't equal right. If you may be able to speak it because, your parents spoke it, but you didn't learn to read and write, or you only learned a little bit of reading and writing. And for example, you don't know the differences between a term that has classical usage and a term in the modern day. And, since rake was so popular, ba, we were talking about the fact that it's a shuijiao term. And, everybody's used to the modern standard usage of raking, which is, raking leaves like on the sidewalk, straight across. But it has a older classical Chinese definition, which is digging out, which is more related to the agriculture. And in the martial arts application of ba, raking, right, this particular ba, right, there is more the idea of the raking, of the raking as far as the agricultural, and that you're scooping out. You're not just coming straight across, you're coming in and you're scooping out and up, right? But then, for example, there's another ba, which can mean raking, but in the term of martial arts, it actually means to climb on you or to cling to you. It's another ba. It's a homophone. It's a different character, and it has a different meaning. And there's so many things that sound the same, and for example, the person who I'm talking about, they speak Chinese, but obviously they don't write very well. They don't read and write very well. So they made numerous mistakes. Piqua, which in Cantonese we call pekwa. Now, there is two versions of this right now. There is what remained in the north, which became known as Piqua palm, right? And then there is the version that was fused with what was called dicing or dashing, which is the monkey style of kung fu, and it's taught in Hong Kong, and they call it dicing mun, right? And I pointed out that the three sets that they have in dicing pekwa mun or dashing piqua men show the diversity in what the system originally was, because the first form is, I'm going to use Cantonese, pekwa fist, pekwa palm, and pekwa kicking or leg. In the north, it's the forms have their different names, and they're all called, the system as itself is called Piqua or Pekwa palm. Now, the P Pek is one of those characters that it's everywhere in Chinese martial arts. Everywhere. So you have to ask yourself something. If you don't know how to even write that character, how reliable are you as a source of information? Baji twin. Not that common in the West. A little more common now than maybe when I was, started training 40 plus years ago. But you can certainly look it up on, there's this thing called Google. I don't know if you know about this. There's this thing called Google. You can go on Google and you can look things up. You can look up what the characters are. If you put the wrong characters, when I say, well, you're talking about manuscripts. Well, I know about this manuscript that disproves you. Did you read it? Maybe if you don't really read Chinese that well, one, you're afraid to go look at a manuscript because maybe you're wrong about something, or maybe you didn't read the manuscript and somebody told you what it said because you can't really read that well. And so until you get somebody to read you the other manuscript, you're not really sure what the answer is. There's nothing wrong with being Chinese and not being educated in Chinese language, which is very common. But then don't set yourself up as an expert just because you're Chinese, right? And this is a problem. It's I mean, people outside of China that did not have a formal Chinese education are going to be handicapped by that fact that they didn't have a formal Chinese education. But don't just look at me because you're Chinese and tell me you're an expert. I'm not going to buy it. I've discussed this a little bit. I spent the last almost 2 years translating Deng Xiaoping's Shuijiao curriculum. And he was from Fujian originally, but obviously trained in Nanjing at first, and then he relocated to Taiwan. But when he came to the United States, his students were all what we call ABC, American-born Chinese. And they were ethnically Cantonese, mostly Toisanese. So they spoke Guangdonghua, not Mandarin, what he spoke, but he spoke Mandarin even with a regional dialect, influenced by Fujian. And they didn't know the characters. So it became a hunt, and then which ba is it? Is it the ba raking or is it the ba clinging, Is the ba, grabbing? What is this character? Wow, this is such an old, there's one character in that 84 that is such an old classical character, it does not exist anymore in modern usage. So I had to actually go out and get the special dictionary for those kind of characters. Now again, there's nothing wrong with this, but if a Chinese-born American, if an American-born Chinese who does not read or write Chinese tells you that they're an expert on something just because they're Chinese, don't buy it. Shui, throwing. It's not that uncommon a character, and it's not one of those ones that's really tricky, like I said, this other ba, which is classical usage. It means to throw something on the ground. So it's very useful for throwing, right? Now, among its tactics is die, which is, to trip. So if you're looking at a reference to tripping, is that not wrestling? No, that's not grappling, because grappling can only be what I say it is because I'm trying to advance this agenda. Well, again, let's examine how qualified are you to be an expert on these things. Remember what I said before, one of the worst things when you spread misinformation, one of the reasons you spread information is just ignorance. I can sort of forgive ignorance. But if you don't know the Chinese characters, then that's ignorance. If you can't read everything, well, then that's ignorance. You don't know any Chinese history. You don't know any Chinese martial arts history. You haven't read these numerous studies that have been published in, like I said, the last 50 years. And you're just trying to advance your own personal agenda for whatever reason that is. Well, like I said, Shuijiao was originally Jiaoli, right? Ma Liang advanced the idea of Shuijiao. When Ma Liang used it, he used Shuijiao, with the jiao being the character for horns, which was this original character, going back, remember I talked about Jiao Li and Jiao Di? Meant horns. We know why, right? Because I talked about it. Jiao Di was supposedly wearing a horned helmet and you were trying to gore people with that horned helmet. And I said, if you don't believe that, well, it's the metaphor, the imagery of locking horns. Well, when they set up the Central Guoshu Academy and they set up the Shuijiao program using Ma Liang's term, but wait, I'll get there in a second. Ma Liang was, we don't talk about him much now because he became a traitor. Excuse me. But he was really big in setting up the Shuijiao division, and he probably brought Zheng Dongsheng to Nanjing. We don't know exactly, but he was in the same family, Baoding family. His teacher and Chang's teacher were classmates. They used a different Shuijiao. That second character doesn't mean horns. It also means kind of the thrower to wrestle, but what's interesting is the radical for that one is the leg. When you read about the history of wrestling in China, and we use China quotation marks, because it's a big tradition. When we talk about the Mongolians, who were the best wrestlers, and the Sun Yin was created specifically so they could study and train to try to beat the Mongolians. But the Mongolian style, unlike the Manchurian and the ethnic Han style, the ethnic Han style and the Manchurian style had hand techniques, and like Shobie is still like a leftover from that tradition. Things like Ko, Tao, a bunch of different techniques are still there, but a lot of the leg throwing techniques, we're using the legs to throw people. These are Mongolian. So that second Jiao is a reference to the influence of the leg wrestling techniques, the techniques using the legs, that was brought into Shui Jiao. Also, that politically they didn't want the imagery going back to the idea of goring people with horned helmets. Now, some people like that Jiao in the mainland. For example, that first Jiao, which means horns, is still used because it links it back to Jiao Li or Jiao Di, meaning that trying to perpetuate that it's a one continuous tradition, which it's not. But if somebody can explain that to you, how much of an expert are they on the subject? If they say there's no striking in Shui Jiao, and they say, well, look at the sport, like they do now in the streets. Well, first of all, I've already told you, Shui Jiao has ritual, recreation, and combat. Well, recreation is different than combat, obviously. But it's always been that way. Well, I've said that the combat part is particularly strong among Chen Dongsheng's version because of his affiliation with the Central Guoshu Academy and also with later training the police and the military. But also, he wasn't the first one. And if you go back and look at Ping Jingyi, right? You can't deny he's like the biggest figure in Baoding. Go back and read what he says about how he had striking in his Shui Jiao. And I pointed out to this so-called expert, go and read that. Don't give me the dumb, because there's no striking in the sport. That's not what I'm saying. Don't put up straw men. Don't change the goalposts, all these logical fallacies that people engage in. And again, if you ignore the fact that I just gave you a source, you're manuscript happy, but you don't want to read that manuscript. And again, so you're Chinese. Doesn't mean anything. If you can't read and write, if you got all your training because your father was famous and people let you train a little here and a little there and a little here and a little there. And you know what? Funnily, at your school, it doesn't seem like you do one system. It seems like you do pieces of 4 or 5 different systems. It's interesting. Now, again, one of those systems, you say like, well, they always say there's throws, but I say no, there isn't any throws because you don't teach any throws. Maybe there is throws. Maybe you're just not good at it. Maybe you never learned it, or maybe you're not good at it. That's an agenda. So please go back and think about all the things that I've discussed here. And I will, in the final cut, put up some things to lead you along with this. All right. Thank you once again. And this is David Ross, and welcome to the Lion's Roar.